Hey Ukramedia family, Sergey Praknevsky here, and guess what? I'm bringing back the daily tips. That's right, if you followed me for a while, you remember me doing daily tips about, I think it was 8 months ago. However, I stopped at tip number 60. And by the way, I did not stop because I ran out of material. I simply stopped because I didn't think people enjoyed it. However, I learned that that wasn't the case, so I decided to bring it back. And I'm excited about it because I loved what it did for me personally, for my personal growth. I loved having that daily deadline. I love having that reason to go and search for things and learn new things. And I also love that daily discussion I had with you guys. So I'm excited about it. I hope you guys are too. So tune in here every single day and let's dive right into tip number 61. All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about a property called time. Now, obviously time is a very simple property. However, there's a lot more to it. And really in this video, I kind of want to talk about what time looks like in a timeline. So I'm going to start fresh. I have this Ukramedia logo in my composition. I also have this Ukramedia text and this background image. So I'm going to go into this text and I'm going to use it as a debugger. So I'm going to alt click on the source text property to create an expression for it. And in here, I'm just going to type time. So we all know it. We've used it many times. It's a great property to drive other properties or methods. So it's animated value, right? So we use it to drive things. So however, time is really a property of a current layer. So right now, if we type time, it's a property of this layer, and I can actually prove it to you. So for example, right now I typed it time, and if I go to 2-second mark, it will give me 2 seconds, right? It starts from 0 to whatever. And it's the same thing as us saying this, right? This layer, so this layer, this ukramedia.com layer, and then we're gonna refer to a property of that layer called time. And as you can see, it's the same thing, right? If we go to 3-second mark, we get 3 seconds and so on. Now we can also round this up using a method called a toFix. So all you have to do is just go to the end of it and say toFixed, and then you can tell it how many decimals you want to keep. So let's round it up to 2 decimals. So I'm going to say inside of parentheses, I'm going to say 2, and there you have it. Okay, so time, obviously it's a property of this layer, but it points to this time indicator. So wherever this time indicator is at, if it's at 4 seconds, it's going to give you that value. So if it's static, if it doesn't move, then the value will be static. But if it's moving, it's going to be animated. So that's why it's a perfect thing. Like when we play animation, we just use that value to drive other things. And really, you would think that because it's a property of this current layer, that it would start at the beginning of this layer. But that's not the case. So if you move this to, let's say, 2-second mark, you would think that it would be 0 here. However, it's still 2. So even though it's the property of this layer, it still refers to the origin of this timeline. So that's an important thing. However, if you want this to be the origin, all you have to do is just use a method called source time. And to do that, you just point to this layer and then you can say period source time, and you can just leave it blank like this. And now it's going to start at the beginning of this layer and move forward. Okay, now I'm going to undo everything, but I want to keep talking about time. So really time, again, it's a property of an object or a property. So for example, anything that lives on a timeline, it's at certain, right? It's located at certain time in the timeline. In other words, each object, like a keyframe or a marker, they have a property called time. In other words, they have a certain location where they're located on the timeline. So that's an important thing that we can use to plug it into our expressions. So, but we can find out what is the exact time of that marker, of that key on our timeline, and then use it in our expression. So let me show you how to do that. So let's start with these keyframes right here. So obviously here's a layer, it's a logo, and then the opacity has some keyframes. So what if I want to find out where this keyframe or that keyframe is located? Pretty simple. I'm just going to pick whip to this opacity. So now we're inside of this opacity property, but we're going to keep going. I'm going to say period, and now we're going to refer to a key inside of this. So we're going to use a method called key. Okay, and inside of these parentheses, we're going to refer to which key we want. So it's an index number. So we want index number 1 or 2, whichever one. So I'm going to go with 1. So I'm going to say index 1. So now that we are referring to a specific key, and that key has properties as well. So in one of the properties, obviously it has many, one of the properties is called time. So I'm going to say period time. So now when I click away, you can see that we see the current position, right, the current time of this keyframe. So if I move it, like to back to 0, you see 0, and so on. We can do the same thing for the second key. All I have to do is just change the index value from 1 to 2. And if you have many, it would be 3, 4, and so on. So now this one is at 1 second. So if I move this to 3, you can see it right there. Again, we can do the same method again here to round things up. We can do 2 fixed, and then we can type 2 decimals. All right, so I hope you're getting this so far. Now, we talked about, let me undo all of this. We talked about keys, but let's talk about markers. And in this case, we're going to talk about layer markers. So the same thing applies to layer markers. You can find out where they're at on a timeline. So I'm going to point to this layer right here. Okay, so now we're pointing to this layer. Now I want to grab the marker. So I'm going to say period. So layer has a property called marker. Now marker has other markers, and we're going to use a method, again, the same method called key. So we're going to use key, and then inside of this method, we're going to define which key we want. So we want, in other words, which marker we want. So we want marker number 1 or 2. So I'm going to go with marker number 2. I'm going to say, give me marker number 2. Okay, so now we have marker number 2, and marker number 2 has a lot of properties. So now we want to define which property we want from marker number 2. And again, we're going to do point time. We're going to want, obviously that's the property we want. So when I click away, you can see that now if I move the second marker, let's do 3, it changes. So that can be pretty important when we work with expressions. Okay, so that's good, pretty simple. Now the same thing applies for these layer markers or composition markers. And obviously we dealt with layer, but now we're going to do composition markers. And how do we point to those? Pretty simple. We're just going to say this comp, in other words, this comp. And inside of this comp, we're going to grab a property called marker. And then we're going to grab a key. So we're going to use a method key method. And the same concept here. Which key do we want? 1 or 2? So when we're going to do index number 2, so I'm going to say 2. And the same there as well. Now we have a marker, and it has a bunch of properties. So we want a property called time. So now when I click away, you can see that it gives me the current time of this marker. So there it is. So now if I move it to 4 seconds, you can see that it changed as well. And again, we can use 2 fixed method here. So I'm going to say 2 fixed, and let's do 2 decimals. Okay, quite simple. Now let's do one more thing. Let me undo all of this. Now we can also find out the beginning and the end of our layer. So we can find out the time of the beginning of our layer. So for example, if I move this, so we have the beginning and then what we call endpoints, and then out points. So I'm going to select this, do Alt close square bracket. So we have in and out point. Now notice those are on our timeline. So we can find out where they are on our timeline. So let's point to this first one here. So I'm going to pick whip to this layer. So we have a layer. So we are inside of this layer. And now this layer has a property called endpoint. So I'm going to say period in point. So now when I click away, you can see that it gives me the exact location of this endpoint. So at 1 second, it's 1 second. And again, we can do the same thing for the out. So instead of in, we're just going to say out point. So now when I click away, now we have the out point. So at 4 seconds, it's 4 seconds. And we can actually round this up again. We can use a method 2 fixed, period, 2 fixed, and then we're going to say 2 decimals. So there you have it. Now, another thing I want to talk about is the fact that you can use things other than time. For example, if you work with frames, like I know if I do 3D a lot, so sometimes I work with frames. It just makes sense when you render frames out, you just work in frames. And you want to convert time to frames. And really, there's an easy way to do that. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So for example, what if I'm going to type time in here? Okay, here's my time property. If I move this around, there you have it. Now I'm going to change the time over here of my timeline to, I'm going to press Control and click here. It's going to be frames. So now when I scroll around, everything's in frames. So right now we're at frame number 70, but our time property is showing us time. How can I see frames instead of time? It's quite simple. You just have to use a method called time to frame. So time to frames. And then in here, you can just leave it blank for right now. So when you do that, now it's going to show you the frames instead of time. And you can be more specific in here. You can say, all right, I want the current time. And then you have to specify what frame rate. So my frame rate is 2997, so I'm going to say 29.97. I think if you leave it blank by default, they'll give you that, but if you want to be specific. And there you have it. Now you have frames. So now you can do something with this, you know. For example, let me show you a practical example. Let's point to this time, okay, of this keyframe right here. So I'm going to pick whip to this opacity, and the same thing, I'm going to say key, and we want key number 2, and we're going to grab a property called time. Okay, so now we see time of this key, right? So let's do like right here, 3-second mark or something like that. Now we want to see, instead of time, we want to see frames. So how would we make that happen? Quite simple. I'm going to give this a variable. So I'm going to say, A, you're going to be this. So anytime I refer to A, I'm really referring to this. So just a short way of, instead of me typing this over and over, I can just type A. So I'm going to close it with a semicolon. And then we're going to go in here and we're going to use a method called time to frames. Okay. And in here, I'm going to say use A. And I'm going to click away. You can see now it shows me 91. All right, I think I'm going to stop right here. I think I already went way too far with this. However, I will pick it up tomorrow. So I'm going to show you some practical things of how you can use time property in the real world projects. So come back tomorrow, I'll show you some practical things. And also, if you like this video and if you want me to keep going, please like this video, share it, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also follow us on social media. Join our mentoring group at ukramedia.com/community. And if you want to learn more about expressions in After Effects, you should definitely take my course at ukramedia.com/expressions. I go through a lot of the basics, a lot of the stuff that you need to know to know expressions, to understand expressions. So definitely go check that out. But until next time, my name is Sergey Praknevsky, and this is ukramedia.com.